Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Human Challenge, where we explore all the human challenges in today's world, the challenges of being human, and how we can challenge ourselves to be more human for the greater good. I'm your host, Vanessa Ferlano, and today we are joined by Petra Molnar, lawyer and anthropologist specializing in migration and human rights. She co-runs the Refugee Law Lab at York University and has recently published the book, The Walls Have Eyes. Welcome to the show, Petra.
Thanks so much, Vanessa, for having me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for writing your book, The Walls Have Eyes. I read it. I literally finished it yesterday and it was so fantastic. I just loved it. I'm in the impact investing space and I was reading through it and I was like, the uses of technologies on borders. And I just kept thinking to myself, I was like, do we think about things like this when we're doing our diligence? Like, is this part of our diligence? And I just think it was so fantastic. And I hoped you could tell us a little bit about you, tell us about your journey and, why you do what you do and kind of why it led to this book and all of your work.
Oh, and thanks again for reading it and for engaging with the work. It really means a lot, because I wrote this book in a way that is accessible, hopefully, to a broad group of people. It's not an academic book, I promise, but it is a serious one, and it's also not an area that I ever thought I would work in, frankly. I'm a lawyer by training. I specialize in refugee law, and I'm also an anthropologist, but not a tech person. You know, 6 years ago, before I started working on this book, and it's been 6 long years, I barely knew what an algorithm was. I didn't think about AI. I was working on immigration detention cases, deportation, violence against women, things like that. And I'm someone with my own migration story and a complicated history in many ways, and it was kind of a happy accident in a way that I fell into trying to understand technology and migration from a way of kind of unpacking it from the power perspective, because technology is ultimately about power and it kind of exacerbates the vast power differentials that are present in our world. And back in 2018, when I kind of came across some really problematic projects that the Canadian government was doing, it really opened my eyes to this intersection and also just needing to kind of write more about it and make it more accessible to a broad audience. So my co-author, Lex Gill, who was at the Citizen Lab at the time at the University of Toronto, and I wrote this report called Bots at the Gate way back 6 years ago. And that kind of got quite a lot of attention globally. And no one was more surprised than me at this kind of intersection, again, of tech and migration. But then I started asking questions, what's happening on the global scale? Because I do find comparison, I think, like many of us, a very useful analytical tool to see, well, if this is happening in Canada, what's happening in the EU? What is happening in Palestine? What's happening in East Africa? What's happening at the US-Mexico border? And through kind of slow project building and living in some of these places and going to some of these places, the project kind of took shape and culminated in the Walls of Eyes.
Right. And so, you're talking a lot about so it's interesting. I feel like the when I'm listening to your story, you're talking about like human rights, migration, and then tech came for you later. For me, it's like kind of the opposite. I'm someone who came from tech, and then I found myself as I've learned more about tech becoming more interested in how it's used in these different contexts. And so, maybe just for all of us here, can you describe the context of border technology and how it does change the way that people move, and then we can get a little bit more into the book.
Yeah, sure. Because it's great, I think, to start with a bit of an explanatory overview, because basically at every point of a person's migration journey, we are now impacted by technology, and a technology that's often untested, high risk, very opaque, and oftentimes we just don't even know. I mean, there's stuff that happens before you even move, for example. If you're active on social media, different governments might be scraping your social media activity for risk profiles that are made against you, based on, for example, which mosque you go to on Fridays or who you associate with. Then, as you are moving and, heaven forbid, you find yourself in a humanitarian crisis or a refugee camp, that's where we're seeing different biometric technologies like iris scanning, fingerprinting take place. And then also the border space is where, some more kind of quote unquote traditional technology around the surveillance paradigm is coming out. So things like drones, cameras, infrared sensors. But more recently, even more kind of scientific, sci-fi, high-risk technology like robodogs, which were recently announced at the US-Mexico border, or AI lie detectors that the European Union was playing with. And then even kind of at the tail end of your journey, maybe once you're in a new country or you're waiting to be reunited with your spouse, there's all sorts of other technologies there too, visa triaging algorithms, voice printing technologies, and different data gathering schemes that, again, make profiles about people sometimes without your knowledge. But again, it's this kind of broad area of migration management technologies that impact us all now, and yet the law and the regulatory space and even just public conversations still have a long way to go to catch up to the reality that's happening.
Right. And I remember in some of the examples you listed, I remember reading about those in the book, the iris scanning in some refugee
Mhm.
camps, and then also how refugees, if they refuse to want to use it, that they would not be given their food rations and all that. So, yeah, I mean, I just think it's, yeah, I mean, I found your book so eye opening. You know, the different uses of technology, and I think sometimes you can kind of hear about it. Like I'm Mexican, and I do know a lot of refugees who have also crossed into the U.S. through the border, and we hear those stories, but I think that to see it in your book, especially given your expertise and your background and your work, was just very eye opening, very very eye opening, and then all the example that you listed. Specifically to the book, you open and close the book with the story of Zaid, and I hoped you might be willing to tell us a little bit about the story here. And then I'm curious, given that you've collected so many different stories, why was this the one that you chose to actually open and close the book with?
Yeah, over the years that I've been working, I've been really privileged to work very closely with people on the move. And that's, I think, part of the methodology of my work, but also the book. It is driven by storytelling and story sharing, with permission, of course, and in more of a partnership kind of way. And I'm really glad that you picked up on Zaid's story, because that was precisely the motivation. Zaid actually wrote the afterword for the book through WhatsApp and through translated messages and communications like that. But we spent quite a lot of time together when he was living in a refugee camp outside of Athens. And he became integral to the book because it not only deepened my own understanding of the situation, but it was a relationship and a friendship that kind of kept growing over the years. And I know it's sometimes maybe strange to hear an author or like a part-time academic like me talk about friendship and research and project, but it is relational in the end. And I think so much of the work that's done in this space is a bit arm's length from people, and it's also very extractive. Researchers go in, kind of gather a bunch of data, go out, write their book, build their career on it, on the misery of others, right? And I mean, storytelling is inherently extractive, but I think it can be done differently when it's done carefully in partnership with people on the move, our colleagues who are in displacement, and kind of also as a way to shed light on the kind of the complexities of the border. And so Zaid's story was the perfect bookend in a way, because I also felt like someone currently on the move needs to have the last word in the book. And I struggled with this kind of balance anyway with the book because I didn't want to center myself in it at all. It's rather about the stories of the people that are crossing different borders, and each chapter kind of tries to do that, to have a bit of a bookend of these kind of vignettes to help illustrate it for people. But it's been an amazing opportunity really to get to know people on this deeper level, and I'm glad that it hopefully comes across in the book.
Yeah, no, it was great, and I think it makes the book very real, from my perspective and
Yeah.
reading it, hearing the, like you said, like there's the research side to it, but like you said, it's not necessarily
Mhm.
academic, but that data is present to tell the story,
Mhm.
but then having other people's stories makes it real, right? To understand the impact of how these technologies are used by private sector, by governments, et cetera, and how it actually impacts people's lives and people's ability to migrate to safe spaces, to safe zones due to conflict in their own countries. No, it was honestly really, really great. Can you maybe break down for us, because you talked about some of the examples. Can you break down for us the different borders that you go through lined up to those examples?
Sure. So the book actually starts off at the U.S.-Mexico border, and that's where those robo-dogs that I mentioned come in. Back in February of 2022, the Department of Homeland Security announced that they're planning to roll out these kind of draconian-looking, sci-fi project-looking kind of robo-dogs that you would see on, Black Mirror or some sci-fi show like that. And it was honestly some of the most surreal kind of moments of my career up to date, because I was in the Sonora Desert working with some search and rescue groups who were doing, water drops or giving medicine to people on the move, or sometimes finding human remains. And, I've gone into the Sonora with these groups and saw memorial sites of people who've passed away, making the very dangerous journey to across the desert into the United States. And to think that these are the spaces where, again, these high risk, oftentimes totally opaque and kind of discretionary uses of technologies like robodogs are kind of coming into play was quite something. And then as the book kind of moves along, some of the other following chapters are more about the European Union, where I found myself in 2020 to kind of expand some of this work, thinking, oh, I would stay in Greece for 2 months or something as a research visit, and I stayed for 2.5 years. If that's not ethnographic commitment, I don't know what is. But Greece in particular was very fascinating because it was one of the epicenters where, again, technology and migration intersect, both from the surveillance side in terms of what's happening along the fringes of Europe, including pushback operations facilitated by technology. So using, for example, surveillance to pick out boats in distress, but instead of allowing them entry into European territory and therefore allowing people to claim asylum, boats are intercepted and sometimes pushed back to places like Turkey or Libya, and basically in contravention of international law, because you're not allowed to do this. Every person on the planet has the ability to claim asylum. And yet again, surveillance technology is pushing people further and further away. And Greece is also an example of more kind of carceral type technologies. So refugee camps that are becoming highly, highly securitized and digitized, again, through biometrics, drones, different types of surveillance. And then there's a few chapters too about kind of more maybe broader concepts, things like digital colonialism and the extractive use of technology on the African continent, in Kenya and the Somalia border, for example. And then also the occupied Palestinian territories and the use of Israeli technology that is tested out in Palestine and then exported out into the rest of the world. And these are all places that I have been to, oftentimes multiple times, or lived in. And again, and they're used, I think, as a way to try and tell this global story of how the development and deployment of technology at the border is hurting real people.
Yeah. And so out of all of this work, what was the most maybe surprising thing that you have kind of learned going through your work?
Mm. Oh, so many surprises. Maybe I'll start with a negative and then a positive, if I
Sure.
may. I mean, or
Mhm.
the thing that shocked me, I suppose, and
Mhm.
maybe that was a slight kind of naivete because I'm also not a numbers person, but I was really shocked at this industry that has grown around the use of technology at the border. I mean, colleagues like Todd Miller, who's a journalist in Arizona, he was one of the first people to use this term called the border industrial complex. And that's precisely what it is. It's now, I think, projected to be $70 billion worth of an industry. And not only is that troubling from like this massive financial perspective, but also from a normative perspective, because it's the private sector that gets to determine what we innovate on and why. So, of course, if countries are concerned, quote unquote, about the problem of migration, and the private sector comes in and says, "Well, we have the solution for you. Here's a robodog. Here's an AI lie detector," that again kind of sets the stage. But we have to query why that is because, obviously the private sector makes a lot of money out of this. And it could also function in a very different way. Like, instead of robodogs and AI lie detectors, we could use AI to augment or audit immigration decision making or root out racist border guards. But it's a choice, right? It's a set of choices that weaponizes this technology against often marginalized populations. And I think the scale of this industry is something I found quite shocking. I've been to some of the conferences, right, like the World Border Security Congress and other types of expos where you walk into these halls and you just see a tank, a robodog, a drone, and it's so normal. It's just normalized, right? Like this is the way, this is the techno solution, to all
Yeah.
these complex societal issues. And I think the reduction of people to a problem to be solved, I mean, that's something that I found really, really shocking.
Thank you for sharing that. I like this final statement, the reduction of people to a problem that needs to be solved. I love that statement so much. And it is unfortunate that we take this lens, we get really caught up in capitalism, really, that we just sort of forget who's on the other end of this. We see it too when we do a lot of work with supporting people who want to deploy capital more equitable, but then more equitably. And then a lot of times, a lot of the offerings that are offered are for these maybe underrepresented founders, and they're the ones who are taught how to conform. Well, you have to present your business ideas like this, and it has to sound like this and look like this, et cetera, et cetera. And so we try to take this other approach where we're like, well, actually, if we're the investors who want to change, we have to be willing to be a bit more open-minded, and we have to stop looking at these people as the problem that needs to be solved. Maybe we're the ones that have to expand our knowledge, open up our eyes a little bit, and be a little bit more open-minded to different stories. And so I appreciate that statement a lot. Maybe in going through, the book, what do you think is the most surprising thing that a reader might learn from your book?
Yeah, perhaps maybe the widespread kind of deployment of this technology
Mm-hmm.
and how varied it really is. Because, some of it is maybe kind of less sexy at first blush. We're talking about like algorithms or visa triaging, things that you can't really see or sometimes even conceptualize, right? 6 years ago, I barely knew what machine learning was or algorithmic decision making. And sometimes you think, oh, well, it's just something that happens out there, doesn't concern me. But that's just one kind of side of things, and also a very important one to pay attention to, because so much happens kind of under the hood that we just don't understand, right? And that's where the discrimination and racism can really be baked into these decisions. But then again, yeah, you have all sorts of very kind of sci-fi-esque projects too that kind of grab our attention and are very, very visceral, whether it's the robo-dogs or the AI lie detectors or voice printing technology that somehow decides that, you're from a particular province in Syria versus other. I mean, all of these kind of assumptions about human behavior and how we are meant to act when we interact with technology. I think that might be surprising to readers, because it was to me. And perhaps, I guess, to sum that up, it's also what is surprising is, again, this kind of just this hubris of technology and people who develop it, to think that, again, a technical solution is always appropriate, that more data is always better. But again, we need to think about what this technology is actually doing to real people, and what are some of the underlying assumptions and power differentials that power this whole kind of sector.
Absolutely. As a reader of the book, I agree that those things were also surprising to me. I think a lot of the stories that you also shared, like for example, the refugees who did not want to get their eyes scanned and then were not able to receive their food rations at the refugee camps. Like, I think it's a lot of those stories too, like that really punctuate what you're talking about. That really were surprising to me. And even I think you also talked about the United Nations agencies, right? Correct. Also being one of them, the potential of data being shared to governments when these are refugees that are that are fleeing unsafe conditions, and then their data being shared with governments that they're fleeing from was obviously very dangerous. The pushback stories you shared, I think these were points for me where I would read them and I would have to like pause and literally put the book down just to like let that sink in, because there's a part of you that's like, I don't want to believe this is real, but like it's real because you're sharing the story, and it's very disheartening, I think, to think this is the world that we live in, that you know you're talking about international law and saying under international law people have the right to seek asylum when you land on international soils that are, but then I see it as just like being human. I'm like, how can we, create these conditions and not allow people to just live safe lives that they're. I've been reading a lot too about even like the refugees on the Olympics teams and their stories, and it's just like, whoa, how we can, prefer to live in this society that's just division and separation, instead of something a little bit more collective. But yes, all those things very interesting and surprising to me as a reader.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that, because I think that's precisely what I hope that the book does, and even just my work in general is to find our way back towards humanity, and centering the human story in all of this, because I sometimes feel like we've lost the plot on migration conversations. It's become so politicized and so dehumanizing, and people on the move kind of being portrayed as threats or
Yeah.
frauds, and kind of something to be managed, right? When really, at the end of the day, any one of us could be a refugee. In fact, many of us have been, right? And not to mention that, but it also, I think, doesn't really get to, first of all, the root causes of why people are forced to move in the first place, whether that's environmental degradation, largely caused by the West, whether that is imperialism by Europe and North America, whether that, is conflicts that are ongoing. I think, for me over the years, and I've been working in migrant justice since 2008, even before I became a lawyer. And I've spent so much time with people on the move. And I think we forget that, like, people don't want to be refugees. I'm not saying that people don't have, economic reasons for migrating. And of course, sometimes people make, decisions that are problematic. But the center of it must be this return to, well, what even is actually happening in reality. And I think again we've lost the plot because we've allowed the conversation to get so politicized without actually thinking about the fact that it's real people who are being caught at the sharpest edges of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think just to this point of it being politicized, it's just an excuse for it's become an excuse or a distraction, maybe not an excuse, but a distraction to continue things like imperialism and to actually keep away from the root of these problems, which is why, we're all these discussions on like climate change, sustainability, et cetera, like the root of them are things like this, that it's just these imperialistic colonial agendas that if you actually want to stop these things, we need to have a much different lens of how we're viewing it and where it starts from. Just given that we've chatted a little bit about, we've talked about tech, we've talked a bit about, we've talked a little bit about, governments. I know in the book you talked a little bit about private sector and government sector involvement, and wondered if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure, and I think that relationship between the public sector and private sector is a really key kind of point to focus on, because oftentimes, right, governments who want to use technology don't have the in-house capacity to develop it themselves. So they rely on private sector to kind of outsource the building of these projects. But again, even just from a legal perspective, we're talking about two very different legal regimes in terms of who's responsible for when things go wrong, public accountability and oversight. What does that look like, right? And we oftentimes see this almost like a responsibility laundering for when something goes wrong, because again, the public sector can say, well, we didn't develop this tool. It actually is, the problem of the private sector. The private sector can say, well, but we sold it to our client, right? So it's also not our problem. And then the rights holder falls in the middle, so to speak, right? With very little recourse. But I think again, the kind of public-private partnership issue also again highlights like who is around the table and who makes decisions. Who gets to imagine what world we live in and what we innovate on and why, right? And whose priorities actually take precedence in this again highly lucrative industrial complex. Um, it's also interesting, right? Because there are obviously people in the private sector who are, standing up for example, what's happening in Palestine right now, right? Like no tech for apartheid, no tech for ICE in the United States, for immigration enforcement technology, different kind of campaigns being led by Google workers, Microsoft workers. But again, it's about the kind of power that the private sector has to set the stage and set the agenda. And we really need to think about the pipeline of how these projects are developed. And, you know, I've seen this multiple times where, if I talk to the private sector, sometimes there just is a big difference in lived experience. I'm not saying that, there are no former refugees who are working in tech or people with migration backgrounds. Of course there are, but I just mean the people who are around the table oftentimes either don't want to think about or don't think about the ramifications of what it is that they're developing. And sometimes I ask, like, oh, who's an engineer? A couple of hands go up. Who's a data scientist? A couple of hands go up. Who's ever been in a refugee camp? Not many hands.
Mm-hmm.
Who's ever, been in a criminal proceeding where you might face facial recognition and predictive policing? Nobody. Who's ever applied for welfare algorithms, right? There is this huge divide. And because we have this tendency to kind of work in silos still, I think we need to have these cross-sectoral conversations to then really drill down and ask, well, what is the technology really doing? And why aren't the affected communities around the table making the decisions that really need to be made? And maybe even saying, we don't want this tech in our world in the first place. Like, are we okay with robo-dogs at the border? And if I can just quickly add, I know I mentioned these robo-dogs, but I think it's an important example because it also doesn't just stay at the border. So the robo-dogs that were introduced at the US-Mexico border in 2022, the following spring, the New York City Police Department proudly announced that they wanted to use robo-dogs on the streets of New York to keep New York safe, quote unquote. And one was even painted white with black spots on it like a Dalmatian. So normalizing, again, the border technology that is first tested at the border, then it becomes part of our kind of daily life. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to start caring about this because it will affect us all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I remember you highlighting that in the book as well. And that it's just the testing grounds, and eventually it's going to come full circle to us. And by that point, is it too late to, what will already have been so normalized by that point? Your final chapter of the book was about resistance and ways to different strategies. I think it was of resistance was the terminology you used, and I really like that chapter a lot because I think it a lot of your stories did um, depend on other people in these communities that their form of resistance was compassion, was really supporting refugees and migrants, and whether it was, you mentioned in the Sonora Desert, the water drops and medicine deliveries and whatnot. And so I love this chapter a lot because I felt that was part of that message, was that, resistance or compassion is also a form of our resistance. And so I know you do a lot of work as well with the Migration Technology Monitor, and so would love to, maybe if you want to share a little bit more around that and in other ways of resistance.
Oh, sure. And thanks for asking that because, yeah, I mean, it can get pretty bleak pretty fast, I think. And the book can be a bit dark at times, but it does end on this maybe more hopeful note. And it also, for me, was really important to focus on mechanisms of resistance, but also kindness and compassion and just even thinking about kind of how we tell the stories that we tell. Because in every single situation that I have been over the last 6 years writing this book, as horrible as some of them were, there were always people showing up. Whether it's the Samaritans and the search and rescuers in Arizona, many of whom are like 70 or 80-year-olds who are retired and they could be on a sun lounger, but instead they're choosing to go into the desert multiple times a week. Like that to me is amazing.
Mhm.
Or people opening up their homes in conflict zones when, they've never really been political or it never really affected them before, but deciding, no, like this is the right thing to do. When there was a conflict at the Polish-Belarusian border, and like hundreds of people were trapped in this kind of corridor. Polish farmers were opening their homes and putting green lanterns on the front porch so that people from Iraqi Kurdistan who don't speak Polish, right, would know that this is a safe house where they could get some food or a piece of honey cake and then kind of be on their way. And I just found that really, really touching and really moving. And maybe I'm a bit of a glutton for punishment, but this is actually going to be the topic of my second book, because I also need to focus myself, I think, on some of these positive stories because it I think seeing really a lot of the difficulty does impact you psychologically too, and it's something that I also want to give some space to, focusing on the way that we can stand up to this and stand up to this kind of tech oppression. Because there are also ways, there are people who are fighting this legally in courts. There are, again, like I mentioned, the private sector workers who are standing up. Um, and there are, maybe our project that you mentioned, the Migration Technology Monitor is one of the examples too. We would like to think, because we started this a few years ago, and it was going to be kind of an observatory and a platform for holding some of this work on border surveillance, but it kept growing into a community. And last year, we launched a fellowship program directly for people on the move and refugees to tell their own stories on surveillance tech. And we pay them a stipend for them to be with us for a year. We incubate their project, and again, we started the second cohort this year, and it's been really amazing to see a diversity of projects too, not just critiques on surveillance, which some of my colleagues on the move are doing, but also, for example, looking at some of the empowering ways that technology can be used. One project comes to mind by my colleague Simon Drotti. He's a data analyst and a refugee living in Uganda, and he created this really beautiful platform called the Memory Scroll, which is basically a digital archive for his community on the move. And I think there's something really powerful about that, these solutions and projects designed on the ground from specific communities. And, if we can open up some of these spaces and also query, who gets to be around the table, who has access to funding, which is a huge issue, right?
Mhm.
And also who counts as an expert. We want our colleagues on the move to be experts as well on this because they're living this daily. And so that's some of the ways that we try and do things a little differently at the Migration Technology Monitor.
That's amazing, and I think, the storytelling and story sharing is a crucial part of this, for bringing awareness, but also for people on the move as well who really need that. My final question for you today, because this is the human challenge, based on your context and the work that you're in, what is the biggest human challenge that you see, and how can we challenge ourselves to be more human around that context?
I think I would have to go back to that point about dehumanization and kind of seeing each other in opposition to ourselves somehow, or as a community that we can't relate to just because somebody happens to be in a conflict zone or a refugee camp or on the move. But again, we all hold such complexity with the way that we move through the world. And I think we need to hold that same complexity for people on the move. I mean, this is maybe where storytelling does come into play, because we can draw these comparisons and similarities out between all of us on this planet, right? Because at the end of the day, it is, I think, about finding our way back towards a shared common humanity that will hopefully allow us to propel ourselves towards a more just and fair world that I think a lot of us are working towards.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I think those are very perfect words to close this episode, by creating a more just world. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all of your hard work and for publishing this book. Where can we buy this book before we
Oh,
close?
thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, the book is available pretty much anywhere books are sold. Hopefully, a small local bookshop if you frequent that, but it is also available in the bigger places and on Amazon.
Perfect. And how do we stay in touch with you so we can stay informed in all of your work?
I have a website, which is petramolnar.com. I'm also on Twitter. Sometimes that platform has really gone downhill, but I am still there sometimes. Or you can follow our work at the Migration and Technology Monitor.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And links will be provided in the description. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you so much.